Well, hi, Stu Bainey coming to you from Pawleys Island, South Carolina. And I want to talk in this message and in coming messages about miracles. Miracles that Jesus still works. Sort of a masterclass on miracles. But before we do that, I want to go back and look at the backstory, the prequel, give you a couple little ideas about what miracles really are. It's important for you to understand as you look at the miracles in the New Testament. First is this, that miracles are a violation of the laws of nature. There is no other possible explanation when we see a New Testament or Old Testament miracle than the direct intervention of the hand of God. They are beyond human power and ability. Secondly, the primary purpose of a miracle is to authenticate the message of the miracle doer. Only one sent by God can do this. They're called semeion or signs. They point the way. They are directional. They authenticate the messenger, that this person is unique, sent by God, because only God could do what they are doing. They're semeion, signs, to authenticate the one who was sent by God. Remember Moses in Exodus with the 10 plagues? The court magicians of the Pharaoh tried to duplicate what Moses was doing, but they quickly ran out of steam. They can't do what only God could do. In this sense, miracles are pointing to the authority and the authenticity of Moses, and Moses alone as one sent by God. And three, miracles teach us something. They teach us about the present reality. A person is healed, the blind see, the lame walk, the hungry are fed. But they also teach us a timeless truth outside of that present moment, a timeless spiritual truth good for you and me and all people for all times and in all places. And that's what I want to look at, the present reality, the present moment, and the timeless spiritual truth. Now, it's in that context of miracles that Jesus still works that I want to look at a special, unique miracle in the New Testament. Question: what is the only miracle that we find in all four Gospels? It's the story of the feeding of the 5,000. And I want to look at that story in this message. John writes for us in John chapter 6, verse 1. After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And a large crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. After this, after what? Well, he had just been to the pool of Bethesda. A lame man who hadn't walked in 38 years picked up his bed and walked. Word spread like wildfire. Jesus is moving from Jerusalem to Judea and back to his home turf, to Galilee. A large crowd is following him. It's unprecedented, the size of this crowd, especially in little Galilee where there are villages of 120 to 200 people. The story tells us that there are 5,000 men. That means there would have been women and children with them, maybe 10, 15, 20,000 people. Again, it's unprecedented. They're hanging on every word. Everyone wants to see what Jesus is going to do and what he's going to say next. So Jesus goes up on the mountain on the other side of the lake. He sat down with his disciples. It is the Passover season. It is the spring of the year. John writes, lifting up his eyes then and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. Jesus is looking around and he sees this large crowd coming toward him. So he said to Philip, "Hey, Philip, where can we buy enough bread, enough food to feed all these people?" Philip had grown up in Galilee and he was in charge of the logistics of the little discipleship group, the food, the crowd, the organization, the structure. Now, Jesus said this to test Philip. He knew exactly what he was going to do, but he wanted to teach something to Philip and to the rest of the crowd. Philip knows they have a logistical problem. It's getting late. They're out of time. They're living in a 5-mile-an-hour world. Nothing goes faster than a horse or a donkey. They're far from home. There's no Chick-fil-A. There's no Subways around. We've got a big problem, Jesus. A half a year's wages, 200 denarii, are not enough to buy even a little bit for these people. Just a little bit to eat. This is a train wreck. Philip is looking from our perspective. The only option, Jesus, is to send them home. There's nothing else we can do. John continues in verse 8. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they for so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. I love this. All of a sudden, Andrew, Peter's brother, shows up with a little boy. He says, "Hey, there's a boy here. He has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down. It's spring. It's the Passover season. The grass is green. Let them sit on the grass." Luke says they divided up into groups of 50. They took their time. They got organized before they got started. Then Jesus took the bread and the fish, and he gave thanks to God. He prayed the Hebrew prayer of thanksgiving over a meal that he learned as a child, directed towards God. Then they distributed as much as the people wanted, a direct violation of the law of nature. So much so that the food was fully sufficient for the people. And then John writes in the conclusion of the story in verse 12, "And when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, 'Gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost.' So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with the fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. And when the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, 'This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world.' Perceiving then that they were about to come and to take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself." Okay, what can we learn from this story, this masterclass on miracles that Jesus still works? What about a violation of the laws of nature that only God can do, or a semyon, a sign pointing to one who was sent by God, or the timeless truths that we can learn today, not just the present moment back then, but what about our lives today? A couple things I want to point out to you. One, the often overlooked story of the response of the crowd. Did you catch it? Did you notice it there? Did you catch that? Did you see what the crowd wanted to do after Jesus had fed them, that he was fully sufficient to meet their needs? What did they want to do? They wanted to make him king by force at the Passover. They wanted to overthrow the Roman occupation, restore the kingdom of David. They saw Jesus as the one who had come to rescue them. They wanted to use Jesus for personal gain. Now we have God on our side, on our agenda. What an enormous advantage. Our problems are over. He'll do whatever we need, feed us whenever we want. The agenda of the crowd. Interestingly, the same crowd that shouted, "Crown him," 1 year later, when they found out that Jesus was not on their personal agenda, that very same crowd that shouted, "Crown him," shouted, "Crucify him." So Jesus withdrew from them in the present moment because his kingdom was a different kind of kingdom, and his kingship was a different kind of kingship. He was going to be a different king. Second, notice the response of the little boy. Andrew finds this little guy. He pulls him up by the scruff of the neck into the front of the crowd and stands him in front of Jesus. The little boy has barley loaves and 2 little bait fish. It's the poorest of food. It's what they would consider to be dog food in those days. What is this with so many people? It's absolutely nothing. It's dog food. But to the little boy, it was his lunch, and his mom had made it for him. When I was a little kid going to grade school, I really, really didn't want to go. You know, that first day of class, I was so afraid. My mother made a little lunch for me, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, an apple, and some little candy, put it in a brown paper bag, rolled the top up, gave it to me. I clenched that in my hand. When I got to school, I lifted up the lid of my desk and I put it inside there, and I couldn't wait till lunch because I felt so far away from home, my first day away. And finally, when lunch came, I lifted the lid of the desk and I pulled that little bag out and I opened it up. There was a little note there from my mother about how much she loved me, and the peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, the apple and the candy. Hey, it wasn't any big deal. I mean, to everybody else, it was insignificant. You know, and to that little boy, his lunch that his mommy had given him, those 5 loaves and those 2 little fish, it wasn't dog food. To him, it was his lunch, and his mother had made it for him. It was special. It was unique. It was his lunch from his mother. And Jesus said to him, "Little boy, I would like you to give me your lunch that your mother made for you." But you don't understand, sir. It's mine, and my mommy made it for me. For me, it's personal. It's special. It's all I have. Yeah, I know. I'd like you to give me all you have, your lunch. And the little guy opened his hands and gave over to Jesus everything he had. And when he did, Jesus did a miracle. The greatest miracle that day took place in the depths of the human heart when the little boy released what he had and gave it to God. Only God can change a human heart. I mean, you want to solve our problems today? Ultimately, they're not political or economic or borders or inflation or you name it, the crime, the hatred, the vitriol. It's a problem of the heart. You can't pass legislation to change the human heart. Only God can change the human heart. This little boy figured out what Philip and Andrew and that whole great crowd never figured out, never saw. That the greatest joy in life is not me using God, which is what the crowd wanted to do, but God using me. It was releasing, it was placing my life in His hands, turning my possessions over to Him. It was not about my plan, it's about His plan. And I often question, what have I been holding on to that I need to let go of and release and turn over to God so that He can do a miracle in my life this day? I don't want to be like the crowd, getting God on my agenda. True joy and freedom in life is when we get on the agenda of God Himself. And the final great truth is this, that Jesus is fully sufficient to meet our needs this day. Gather up the leftovers, the fragments. It seems like nothing. I don't want anything lost. A miracle has taken place. Treat this carefully. Pay attention. Jesus has miraculously met the needs of all of the people. He has fed them. They are fully satisfied because a little boy turned over his life to Jesus. It's like the manna in the wilderness, though. Jesus understands that you can't have this for the rest of your days. Like the manna in the wilderness, Jesus only gives enough for this day, for the needs of this day. The scale and the scope of the miracles beyond belief. It would change the world, your life and mine. But He's not going to provide for them and do that same miracle every day. It's like the Lord's Prayer where Jesus says, I want you to pray, give us this day, this day, this day, this day. The crowd looked to the future. Our troubles are over. Jesus wanted to teach them the nature of true faith. The nature of true faith is that God meets our needs, is fully sufficient to meet our needs this day. Question, how long did the manna in the wilderness last? Just this day. They couldn't roll it over to the next day. Rely on me this day. The crowd wanted to feed on the next day. But God promises he'll provide for us this day and this day alone. That's the message of the Lord's Prayer. Give us this day and this day alone. I know we all have lots of problems in our lives. You know, a couple years ago, I went to my high school class reunion, and they had the yearbook there and the pictures of the yearbook. We were all so young, having fun, dancing, singing, playing, athletics, all big smiles on our faces. Yeah, but 30, 40, 50 years later, man, hunger gets in the way, emptiness, broken marriages, estranged kids, bad relationships, a career gone south, medical problems, impossible places. We get hurt. We've gotten bruised and wounded and confused. Life gets complicated. We're no longer those kids in the yearbook pictures. Well, Jesus is trying to tell us here, when life gets complicated like that, if we look at our own resources, if we look to our own resources, it's not enough. It's not enough. Can't feed us. The good news is that Jesus is fully sufficient to meet our needs for this day. He will give us what we need for this day, one day at a time. So let God meet your needs this day, this day, this day, this day. Just concentrate on this day, and you'll find a whole new freedom about life. Don't worry about tomorrow. God doesn't promise the trees that it'll rain tomorrow. He doesn't promise the birds of the air that it'll feed them tomorrow. This day, this day, this day. I love that old hymn. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face, and the things of this world will grow strangely dim in the light of his heavenly grace. But if we turn our eyes away from him, look at our own perspective, our own resources, we don't have much to work with. The miracle is that Jesus tells us that he's fully sufficient to meet our needs in his power, in his way, in his timing, right now, today. So like the little boy, release. Let go. Our role is not to get God on our agenda. Our role is to get us on God's agenda. Here, you can have my lunch. It's mine. It's all I have. It's yours this day, because I believe that you will feed me this day. So bring your needs this very moment to him. Bring them this day to him, and let him do a miracle in your life this day. He is sufficient to fully meet our needs. Turn your eyes upon